Out of the Middle East, in which migrant domestic workers have been attempting to kill or severely injure their employing families, like the woman who spilled boiled milk on the 4-year-old boy and the woman who tried to drown her 6-year-old girl. I see the reported accounts as a rising form of resistance from the domestic workers against the dominant group, attempts to counter violence with violence. Most importantly, the rise of such accounts directs our attention to the need to continue to evaluate and understand the relationship dynamics between migrant women and domestic work in the Arab world. My research project looks at the livelihoods of Ethiopian migrant domestic workers in Lebanon. It tries to understand what conditions are in place, both structurally and socially, that subjugate Ethiopian migrant women, and what forms of relationships they have established with those in their social milieu. I examine what ways domestic work is gendered and racialized, and more specifically, how do Ethiopian women experience race and racism. I focus on 3 approaches. 1, by examining if there are communities of Ethiopians and what spaces they occupy. 2, by looking at the form of relationships and intimacies, both local and abroad, with familial and romantic intimacies. And 3, by investigating the source of support and representation available to the Ethiopian migrant domestic workers. Methodologically, I conducted participant observation and interviews with Ethiopian migrant workers, community activists, and social organization leaders. I lived for 2 months with a group of 4 Ethiopian women with 2 close neighbors in southern Lebanon. Majority of my informants are free visas or out-of-home domestic workers, meaning they live separately from their workplace. On average, all of them have lived in Lebanon for 4 years. I also interviewed representatives from the Ethiopian Consulate of Lebanon, Caritas International Migrant Center, and Anti-Racist Movement. For the purpose of this presentation, I'll focus on the process of migration, the social dynamics among the Ethiopian women and other migrant communities. Throughout the presentation, I'll focus on the significance and the function of intimacy between Ethiopian women, their neighbors, and its significance in shaping their identity. Migration to Arab countries from Ethiopia is first and foremost established through networks of close relationships. For the past 5 years, migration to Lebanon as a domestic worker has been banned by the Ethiopian government due to insurmountable accounts of abuse and deaths of migrants in Lebanon alone. As a result, illegal brokers both in Ethiopia and abroad have taken the lead in sending migrants to Arab countries. These processes are rooted in pre-established relationships in Ethiopia, which are the grounding source, if not, in not only securing a path of passage, but also adopting and assimilating. The veteran migrant brokers take responsibility for the work that they bring, take responsibility for the women that they bring. But this responsibility is dependent on the closeness of their relationships. The veteran migrants serve as key agents in aiding their relationship, in aiding their friends integrate and navigate the new country. For instance, a veteran migrant can have the responsibility of being the diplomat that reinforces the contract between the domestic and the employer. The constant contact and communication on behalf of the domestic not only provides care and source of support for the new migrant, but also reverberates the message to the employers that the new immigrant is not alone and has individuals in Lebanon who will take accountability for her. Oftentimes, the condition of exploitation are established at the beginning of the first few months. Therefore, pre-existing ties and communications play a vital role in how the employer and employee relations are formed. The employers know that alienation and lack of language proficiency is key to demoralizing the migrant woman. Alienation is a fertile ground for exploitation and abuse. Knowing this, most employers request for a migrant who is young and who has no knowledge of the Arabic language. As a result, the most vulnerable Ethiopian migrants are the women who have been selected from the most rural parts of Ethiopia. Currently, Ethiopian local brokers seek out migrants from the mud houses and remote parts of southern Ethiopia. What is most, the women's conception of the world is in deficit. They understand the world to only include Ethiopia and South Africa. They are told that they will be taken to South Africa, and when they arrive to large villa homes in the northern hills of Lebanon, their minds cannot comprehend how they'll be able to manage such vast houses coming from single-room mud houses. In addition, these women know very little Amharic, Ethiopia's national language, let alone Arabic. Their lack of understanding Amharic hinders them from communicating with other Ethiopian women, leading to both social isolation and feelings of non-belonging. Furthermore, Lebanese employers understand the benefit of isolating a migrant worker and make strong efforts to hinder the women from having close relationships to each other. They are ready to carry out Carter G. Woodson's statement, "If you can control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions." For instance, most madams do not allow their maids to have any interaction with other Ethiopians. They watch them from the balcony as they walk to the corner market. They shout out their names and warning as they approach another Ethiopian. And they send children to drag them away from groups of other Ethiopian women. It is evident that the employers understand and are threatened by the power of communication among the migrant workers. One of the informants echoed this assertion. She stated, "The Arabs want your mind. They want you to surrender to them your free thinking. As soon as they realize you have awoken from submission, they don't want you anymore. They'll take you back." This form of control deployed by the employers extends well beyond labor obligations and spills into the social and psychological well-being of the migrant women. Despite their populous presence in Lebanon, migrant domestic workers are invisible from the social political scene. There is no social accountability or legal protection for the domestic workers, and as a result, the social trust that they have among themselves is the only source of validation, self-affirmation, and voice of justice. The personal relationships among the Ethiopian women, as well as the community ties, ensures social accountability, representation, and provides the essentials for physical and emotional security. These relationships set the stage for conscious raising and forming of ideal identities among the women. They become the primary source of empowerment through the sharing of stories, through the sharing of practices of resistance. Moving on to migrant community as a whole, Lebanon is a country of many migrants and refugees. The ethnic composition of migrant workers community alone includes women predominantly from Bangladesh, Filipino, Sri Lanka, and men from Sudan. There are similar numbers of migrants from other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly West Africa. Living with the women gave me a sense that the Ethiopian women felt more affection and affinity towards women from Ethiopia, regardless of age difference or religion. And in fact, there is animosity between the migrant women of the different ethnicities. The Ethiopian women I interviewed regarded Sri Lankan and Bangladeshi women as being backward for their conservative choice of dress and their lack of fluency in Arabic, even after remaining in the country for years. Furthermore, Bangladeshi and Sri Lankan women are stereotyped as being complacent by the Ethiopian women since they work at lower wages. Similarly, the only thing the Ethiopian women had to say about Filipino women were that they were hard to work with and the first to be avoided. Filipino women are the most desired and highest paid migrant workers by the employers because they speak English and the employers want their children to learn the international language. There is evident class tension among the migrant workers. The Sri Lankan and Bangladeshi women are perceived as lowering the wage, while Filipino women are perceived as not being productive because they have language skills that provide them more opportunities. Ethiopian women then position themselves between these two groups as being hardworking, reasonable with their wages and work opportunities, as well as having more voice to speak out. With regard to African migrant workers, the Ethiopian women were less abrasive, but still apprehensive in their approach to other non-Ethiopian African women. This is observed when on multiple occasions Ethiopian women would ignore to say hello to me and my friend upon the presumption that I was an African or a non-Ethiopian, and that my friend was either Sri Lankan or Lebanese. Though the Ethiopian women felt more kin to other African migrant workers than they did with Asian migrants, there was very much a distance across the different nationalities. This detachment further emphasizes that the intimacy among the women, the Ethiopian women, the formation of an Ethiopian migrant community is grounded on the identity politics of being an Ethiopian rather than the shared experience of subjugation as a domestic migrant worker. Though the Ethiopian women would not claim affinity with other female migrants, they do share and feel the burden of representation. This sense of sameness was communicated on two accounts. First, the burden of representation was shared and was apparent when one of my informants felt shame and embarrassment over the public display of affection between two strangers, a Sri Lankan woman and an Arab local man. She expressed a feeling of wanting to disappear, not wanting the onlookers to associate her with what she perceived as prostitute-like behaviors. The feeling of sameness is also a result of how the dominant group idealizes the migrant community as having a shared identity as domestic workers. The locals refer to the migrant workers, regardless of their ethnicity, as Sri Lankiye, which has become over the years interchangeable with Shigaliye, or a domestic worker. Though there are Palestinian and Syrians who are also employed as domestic workers, this term distinctively and derogatively refers to migrant workers who have brown and black skin. This jumbling of migrant worker under this term, Sri Lankiye, is an ethnic typification of domestic work as being a particular population phenomenon. This ethnic objectification sets the stage for daily practices of prejudice and discrimination. The gender composition and gender relations. While Ethiopian women are highly just as Sudan and Ethiopia are neighbors geographically, those in Lebanon seek to uphold the virtues of neighborliness diasporically. A thorough historical and contextual framework of the two countries' relationships and cultural similarities is needed to fully understand the roots of friendliness between the citizens, but there is a deep, intimate connection with the Ethiopian women and the Sudanese men. Intimacy that provokes anger, even from the Arab locals. Typically, Sudanese men are employed as security guards, which entails running errands for the residents and other small services that bring them in proximity to domestic workers. Their work proximity, as well as the unbalanced gender composition of the two groups, and the longing for romantic relationships brings forth a closeness between the two groups. Beyond circumstantial factors, both groups feel in solidarity with each other and are often ready to support each other economically and physically. Additionally, I observed the Sudanese men have a particular love and support for Ethiopian women and their culture. Little cues for this was that some of the Sudanese men had picked up Amharic, some fluently, some just for pickup lines. And Sundays were days to post up at the Orthodox church gathering in hopes of finding a catch. And hanging out, the men casually listened to Ethiopian music. Furthermore, Ethiopian holidays and Sudanese festivals are celebrated together, and when concerts are held in Beirut, Sudanese singers are often paired with Ethiopian artists. Dating and marriage for Ethiopian women typically involves Sudanese men, and as such, most of the social tension between the Ethiopian women involves these romantic relationships. While the romantic relationships are reciprocated by the Ethiopian women, during my interviews, the women were extremely hesitant to reveal the romantic relationships that they've had with the Sudanese men. While they spoke enthusiastically of boyfriends and husbands back in Ethiopia, they were reserved about their relationship locally. They felt more comfortable to talk about the ways in which Sudanese men cohabitate with Ethiopian women for survival, and often exclaimed that love was left in Ethiopia. This can be briefly explained as a process of social stigma emanating from the dominant group, as well as the Ethiopian women that perceive Sudan-Ethiopian romantic relationships as being survival measures rather than founded on love. In conclusion, I want to highlight what is at stake in this research. In preparation for this speech, I struggled the most with finding a way to convey my observations without sensationalizing and conflating the experiences of migrant workers and the power relations between the employers and Ethiopian migrants. Hopefully, I've stayed away from doing so by focusing on the dynamics of the social milieu rather than focusing on the tragedies and violences in between. Early on in the summer, I realized the biggest the biggest challenge for me would be to diverge from the typical oversimplification of the complex relationships between the Arab community and the Ethiopian migrants, as they have been stereotyped as being violent Arabs and weak, miserable migrant victims. In the process of the 2 months, I understand what is at stake in this research is preserving the dignity and agency of Ethiopian migrant domestic workers, as well as the spectrum of humanity of Arab employers. Thank you.